When the stock market crashed in 1929, the nation's economy crumbled. Why would a seemingly isolated event have such a dramatic effect? In this chapter, we consider some of the underlying factors behind the Great Depression, as well as the response that was mounted by federal authorities. The first aspect we must consider is embedded within the stock market itself. You will remember that many Americans were investing in the market during the 1920s with borrowed money, and that the prices of many stocks were thus dramatically overvalued. But there were other factors beneath the surface of the economy during the 1920s, and these cracks would ultimately pull the economy apart. The industries that sustained the unprecedented economic growth of the 1920s were not diverse enough. Automobiles, shown here in this image of the Ford Motor Company assembly line, were a major industry, as were appliances, such as radios, and the construction industry. But this was still a relatively narrow range of industries, which meant that when one fell, it would have a devastating ripple effect on the economy. Another factor had to do with the distribution of wealth. Although our popular memory of the 1920s may resemble the glamorous flappers and high living captured by F. Scott Fitzgerald in The Great Gatsby, in reality, many Americans were suffering. Before the stock market crashed in 1929, over half of American families were at or below the poverty line. Our position in the international arena would also be a significant factor in the onset of the Depression. At the close of World War I, European nations had relied upon American exported goods. By the late 1920s, however, they had rebuilt their production capacity and could manufacture their own goods. For all these reasons, and others, the American economy was poised for collapse even before the crash of the stock market. Once that crash occurred, events unfolded quickly. Companies shut down, leaving many Americans unemployed and relying on relief. Banks closed by the thousands, taking with them people's entire life savings. Here we see an image of the Bonus Army. They were a group of World War I veterans who had been scheduled to receive a bonus payment in the distant future. As the Depression set in, they demanded the payment be made early, marching to Washington and setting up a camp in protest. President Hoover authorized the veterans' removal. General MacArthur burned out their encampment and sent them fleeing. By this point in 1932, Hoover was deeply unpopular, and his re-election seemed highly unlikely. As the Dust Bowl compounded the nation's suffering, farmers were unable to pay the mortgages they owed on their farms. Many families loaded up their belongings and left home, looking for better jobs that were nowhere to be found. This famous photograph, known as Migrant Mother, was taken by Dorothea Lange. It captures the weariness and worry of a family with no home. The settlements of homeless individuals and families, such as the one shown here, were known as Hoovervilles. They were named after President Hoover, who was increasingly blamed for the suffering of the country during the Great Depression. He would lose the 1932 election to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a Democrat who believed in enlarging the power and scope of the federal government in order to fight the effects of the economic crisis. Roosevelt's administration would reform the banks, stabilizing them and ensuring deposits so that Americans would be willing to put their money once again into the banks. Many different government programs would be established to put Americans back to work. Unemployment had peaked in the winter of 1932, when 25% of Americans were out of work. Government programs put millions of Americans back to work, building airports and schools, improving national parks and forests, sweeping streets, giving music lessons, recording oral histories, and doing many other types of work. Americans embraced these types of programs, preferring to work for a living than to feel they were receiving a handout. The most lasting piece of New Deal legislation, though, would be the Social Security Act of 1935. This act would create the system we know today, in which both workers and their employers pay into a federal system that then makes payments to those who are unable to work because of their age, disability status, or temporary unemployment. While most of the other New Deal programs were designed to be a temporary response to the crisis, Social Security was engineered to last. All these programs put forth in the New Deal were like Band-Aids on the economy, however. The nation would not fully recover from the Depression until the onset of World War II.